The horse pulled right when we came over the ridge. Not hard, just that small correction a well-trained animal makes, a half step to the side, its ears swinging. My captain noticed it and glanced at me. I noticed it and said nothing. In 8 years of riding Vel through disputed territory, through treaty grounds and ambush country and the long white passes in the north, I had never felt him do that. He corrected back on his own before anyone could remark on it. We rode on down into Ashgate. The border settlement sat in a fold of the hills above the river crossing, low stone buildings, roof thatch weighted with river clay, a market square that smelled of wet wool and iron. The territorial arbitration had drawn a small crowd, not celebrating our arrival, simply watching the way settlements watch when a king rides in and they don't yet know what he'll cost them. I had been doing this for 8 years. I knew how to read a crowd's stillness. I was reading theirs when I saw her. She stood at the edge of the market with a basket of wool card combs, and she was not looking at us at all. She was looking at a length of indigo-dyed cloth strung on a line, checking the color, running her fingers through the nap. Her dress was stained to the elbows with the same indigo. Her hair was pulled back with a strip of plain linen. She was not dressed for ceremony or for watching a king arrive. She was dressed for work, which was all she was doing. My wolf went somewhere I had never felt him go before. Not forward, not the surge I'd heard other alphas describe. The pull toward a mate, the howl of recognition, the chest blow of the bond announcing itself. My wolf went the way a creature goes still when it has finally, after a long time alone, caught a sound it had almost stopped listening for. And then, slowly, he turned. I looked away from her. I dismounted and handed Vel to my captain and went into the arbitration hall, and I did not think about the wool dyer at the market. I thought about the boundary dispute between Ashgate settlement and the packhold of Fenwick, which had sent a council representative named Aldris, who had a narrow face and tight eyes, and a prepared speech I could already see rolled in his hand. I had boundary maps. I had tide-crossing records. I had 8 years of being the kind of king who finished what he came to do. The arbitration hall was low-ceilinged, smelling of tallow and old wood. A long table. Chairs set for the settlement's elected stewards, the Fenwick representative, and my own council clerk. A row of wooden chairs along the back wall for witnesses. I had sat in 100 rooms like it. They all had the same weight, the weight of people who needed a decision that would outlast the afternoon, rendered by someone they had to trust to know the difference between a legitimate claim and an advantageous one. I took my seat. My clerk read the opening terms. Aldris from Fenwick unrolled his speech. He was the kind of representative who believed that the quality of a scroll was correlated with the quality of his argument. The scroll was excellent, fine-pressed parchment, clean ink, a careful hand. His argument was weaker than the scroll. The title boundary at Ashgate had been in the same place for 60 years of recorded history, and Fenwick's claim that it had shifted relied on 3 measurements taken in the same week, during the same unusually high water season, by the same Fenwick surveyor. I listened to all of it. My clerk took notes. The 3 witnesses from the settlement gave their testimony. 2 men who'd worked the crossing for 20-odd years each, and an older woman who ran the lower warehouses and could say from her own records exactly what the tide had and had not reached. Then the settlement's steward read from a list and said, "Selah of Ashgate, witness." A woman stood from the back row. She had left the basket outside. Her hands were still faintly stained. The indigo settled into the lines of her knuckles. She walked to the witness table without hurrying, pulled out the chair, and sat as though she had done this before, composed, not brittle, just very calm. She set her hands flat on the table in the way you do when you have nothing to hide and no reason to fidget. She stated her name for the record. She gave the years she had lived at Ashgate, 7. My clerk noted her name in the settlement register and said, without looking up, "Affiliation?" She said, "None." He wrote it and kept moving, but I caught the margin notation beside her name, the one written in when she first registered to the settlement. No wolf registered. It meant she had come in as wolfless, an omega with no wolf. The settlement registered these things. It wasn't a condemnation, just a record. But wolfless omegas were what they were, women whose wolves had never come, or had gone silent, or, rarest and most final, had simply never been. Packs didn't register them because there was nothing to register. They came to border settlements, to market towns, to places where the pack language wasn't the only one spoken, where a woman could work and be left alone, with no questions asked, about what her wolf did or didn't do. I looked at her and she looked back at me, waiting to be asked something useful. "You've worked the river crossing?" I said. "Not as a crosser," she said. "I lease the second dyeing shed, which sits above the tidal line. I've been there 7 years and the tide has never come to my floor." "Not once?" "Not once? I keep records. I can tell you the date of the highest surge in my 7 years and the mark it left on the lower shed wall." She paused. "It didn't reach my shed." Aldrich said, "The settlement's evidence is biased by settlement interest, my king." He managed to make it sound polite. "Most evidence is biased by someone's interest," I said. I kept my attention on Sella. "Your records, are they daily?" "Weekly during calm seasons, daily during the high water months," she said. "I use the shed's foundation post. I mark the water level every morning at the same hour. The variation is consistent with the tide tables." "You check the tide tables?" "I check the tide tables," she said, as though this were obvious. "I'd rather know." Aldrich shifted in his seat. I said to Sella, "What made you stay here? 7 years in a place not your origin." It wasn't relevant to the arbitration. I had not meant to ask it. She didn't blink. The work suited me. The settlement didn't ask more than I could give. Something in my wolf moved again. That same held attention I'd felt on the ridge above town. I set it aside. I wrote nothing personal. I asked no further personal questions. I guided the arbitration through the remaining witnesses and the tide records, and Aldrich's long speech, and in 2 hours I had what I needed to render a judgment that left the tidal boundary exactly where it had been for 60 years, because it was the honest judgment, and Aldrich folded his prepared speech back into its scroll with a tight mouth. The settlement stewards thanked me. I thanked them. I should have ridden out. Vel was brought around. The sun had moved past noon, the market quieter now, most of the morning trade done. I had a hard 2-hour ride back to my relay camp. My captain was ready. I stood in the hall doorway and could not, for a reason I did not fully understand, get myself to walk through it. I told my captain I wanted to walk the river crossing before we left. He looked at me. We had seen the crossing on the way in. Everyone had. But he was a good captain and said nothing, and we walked down to the river path, and I sent him ahead to give the horses water, and I turned and walked back into the market. I told myself I was looking for the settlement's border markers. I had the maps. I didn't need markers. She was at the dyeing shed, the second one above the river, her cloth lines strung between its roof peg and a hook on the wall of the shed beside it. She was doing something at the water troughs, rinsing, adjusting, the ordinary business of dyeing, which looked like the most precise and patient work I had seen anyone doing that day. Every bucket in a specific place. Every cloth hung at an angle to catch the afternoon light. I came to the door of the shed and stopped. She turned. She registered me, not startled, not flustered, just that same composure she'd had in the hall. "My king," she said, the way you'd say it to someone you were slightly surprised to see at your door. "I wanted to see the title mark," I said. She gestured to the lower shed wall, 15 feet away, where a dark line ran about a foot above the ground, the highest surge, as she'd said. She didn't offer to walk me to it. She went back to what she was doing. I looked at the title mark for perhaps 10 seconds, then I looked at her. The shed was her work, and you could see that in the way everything in it was arranged. The buckets by size along the near wall, the cloth lines at precise angles to catch the afternoon sun, the notebooks stacked on the high shelf away from splash range, the dye pots marked in her hand with the date they'd been opened and what they contained. She worked the way she gave testimony, carefully, without waste, knowing exactly where everything was and what it was doing there. 7 years, I said. She didn't look up. "Where were you before?" She was quiet for a moment, rinsing a length of pale cloth in the trough, wringing it with the efficient twist of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "A pack to the east," she said, "Fenwick." I was quiet. "I know," she said. "Their representative was there this morning. He didn't recognize me. Or he did and chose not to say." She said it without rancor. Just fact. The way you'd report weather. Fenwick. The same pack whose narrow-faced representative had tried to move the title line for tax advantage. The same pack whose surveyor had taken 3 measurements in one high-water week and called it evidence. I thought of the margin notation in the register. No wolf registered. I thought of the things packs did with omegas who couldn't offer a wolf, how it was always framed as a matter of record, as a neutral fact, as something the pack's rules required, how neutral it never actually was. They sent you out, I said. She wrung the cloth and hung it. They recorded me wolfless, she said. The record stands. The pack's choice in such matters is their own. A pause. I didn't fight it. I was 19 and I had nothing to argue with. You were 19 and they told you your wolf didn't exist, I said. She turned and looked at me then, and there was something behind her composure. Not anger exactly, more like the place anger had been, a long time ago, that had been replaced by something quieter. Not peace either. More like the kind of stillness you arrive at after you've stopped arguing with something and started working around it instead. My wolf was silent, she said. I thought for a long time that it meant the same thing, that she was gone, or had never been, that the pack was right. Were there others who said so, before the formal record? She was quiet for a moment. My mother's sister, she said. She was kind about it mostly. She said some wolves just didn't take. She said it wasn't a failing exactly. A pause. She believed it was a failing exactly. You could tell. I said nothing. The moon right at 19 was the last chance as far as Fenwick was concerned, she said. If the shift didn't come then, if no wolf made itself known, that was the determination, wolfless. The pack records it and the pack moves on. She picked up another cloth. I moved on too, eventually. To Ashgate. Eventually to Ashgate. I went to 2 other settlements first. A market town north of here, a trading post on the coast. She wrung the cloth with the same precise efficiency. I was looking for work that suited me. The dyeing suited me. Someone here had a shed they weren't using, and I had 7 years of tide records to show I knew where the waterline was. She almost smiled at her own reasoning. It made sense. And now, I said. She looked at me for 2 full seconds. Then she said, You should probably go, my king. You have a long ride. I took 1 step into the shed. I don't know why I did it. The shed was open on one side. It wasn't a closed space. It wasn't as though I'd come inside in any particular sense. I stepped off the threshold, and the smell of the place settled around me. Indigo, wet wool, the mineral smell of river water, and underneath all of that, something that stopped my wolf mid-breath. She went still at the trough. Not the stillness of composure. Different stillness. The kind that happens when something that has been sleeping for a very long time comes awake. She said very quietly, What are you doing? I don't know, I said. Honest. My wolf was turned toward her with a focus that made everything else, the arbitration, the boundary maps, the ride back, the 8 years of my rule that had never felt anything like this, feel very distant. It wasn't a howl. It was the opposite of a howl. It was a silence inside me that was pulling, like standing at the edge of something deep and feeling the draw of it. She had set down the cloth. She was standing at the trough with her stained hands at her sides, and her face, still composed, still careful, had something moving through it that I recognized without being able to name it. Recognition, maybe. The particular kind that frightens you because you have not prepared for it. I need you to leave, she said. Yes, I said. I did not leave. She pressed her lips together. She looked down at her hands, then at the ground, then past me at the market square. She was trying to hold something in. I could see the effort in her jaw, in her breath, in the slight trembling of her hands that she was not going to let herself acknowledge. She's been quiet for 7 years, Sela said. Her voice was low. I learned to live around it. I learned to not. I learned to make peace with the silence. And right now, I said. She closed her eyes, and her wolf rose. Not like a surge, not like a blow, like a tide, like something the sea had been preparing and now simply released. Unhurried, enormous, inevitable. I felt it before I saw it, a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun, a pressure against my wolf that was not a push, but a recognition, like a sound you have heard before, once, in a different life, and your whole body knows it before your mind has caught up. Then I saw it, a shimmer, silver pale, at the edges of her, the way your wolf's presence makes itself briefly visible when the bond is close to the surface. No full shift, just that, the silver, steady as starlight, pressing outward, turning toward me. My wolf did not surge either. He turned, all the way, and was still. In 8 years he had never been still in that direction before. She opened her eyes. She looked at me with an expression I did not have a word for. Half wonder, half grief, half something that was neither. Three things at once in a face that had learned to show very little. 7 years, she said again, and this time it meant something entirely different. I looked down. On my left wrist, 2 inches below the cuff of my riding coat, a mark was forming. I had seen it described. I had seen it in records. A dim, old-fashioned word from the Moonrights. Bond mark, the paired mark that appeared between mated pairs at the moment of destined recognition. A silver-edged line, like a river seen from above, curving across the inner wrist, exact, unambiguous. I looked at her wrist. The same mark, mirror. 7 years old in its waiting, new in its waking. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "I thought she was gone." "She wasn't," I said. "I know that now." A breath. "What does this mean? For you? What does this? You're the king of Thornmere. This isn't? I am an unregistered Omega in a wool dyer's shed at a border settlement." She said it plainly, not self-pitying, just accounting. Just making sure I understood the facts of her situation in case I had missed them. I said, "You're my fated mate." She looked at me. "The bond mark on my wrist says so." I said, "The bond mark on yours says so. My wolf, who has not done anything like this in 8 years of searching, says so." I stopped. "Sella, I am not going to pretend I understand every piece of this. You've spent 7 years thinking your wolf was silent. I've spent 8 years wondering if I was the kind of man the bond simply didn't come for. We are both going to need a moment." I paused. "But I know what I'm looking at." She was quiet. Then she said, "Aldris is still in the settlement." "I know. He'll see." "I know," I said. "Let him." She looked at me with those composed eyes, and something shifted in them, something long held that was beginning, slowly, to be set down. She lifted her wrist and looked at the mark. Her wolf pressed against the inside of it, warm, patient, as though saying, I know, I was always here." We walked back through the market. I didn't take her hand in the dyeing shed. I didn't need to make a theater of it in private. But we walked out together, and that was enough. A wool dyer in an indigo-stained dress and the Alpha King of Thornmere, crossing a border settlement market square in the late afternoon, and the mark on both our wrists visible to anyone who cared to look. My captain saw us from 20 yards away. He had been leaning against the wall by the horses, a man of singular composure in most situations. He went very still. The settlement's folk stopped what they were doing, the way people do when they can't name what they're seeing but they know it's something. A man who had been loading bales paused with his hands full. 2 women by the water trough turned. The boy sweeping the cobbles in front of the grain store stopped sweeping. The bond mark on my wrist caught the afternoon light. It was unmistakable. Aldris was in the square. He'd been talking with 2 men from Fenwick's trade delegation, going over the arbitration result, probably, working out how to frame the loss to the pack council back home. He turned and saw us, and his face went through several changes very quickly. Confusion, recognition, calculation, and then, when I stopped in the middle of the square and faced him directly, a pale kind of stillness that was not calm at all, but was trying to look like it. "This woman," I said, loud enough for the square, "is registered in your pack's records as wolfless." Aldris said carefully, "She is." "She isn't," I said. I held up my left wrist. The bond mark was visible, silver-edged, unmistakable. The bond requires a wolf. Both wolves recognized each other in that dyeing shed not 20 minutes ago. Your pack's record is in error. He stared at the mark on my wrist. He looked at the one on hers. His face moved through another sequence of calculations, arriving at nowhere particularly useful. He said, "With respect, my king, a border settlement is not a registered Moonright site. A mark appearing outside a sanctioned—" "The mark doesn't care where it appears," I said. "The bond doesn't require a pack house and a Moonright to be real. It requires a wolf and a match, both of which are documented here." I kept my voice level. Aldris was not a stupid man. He knew what he was looking at. He was simply performing the last few movements of a position that had already lost. Your pack drove a 19-year-old woman out of her home because you recorded her as wolfless. Her wolf was silent, not absent. Your record was wrong. Aldris was quiet. The square was quiet. The 2 men from Fenwick's delegation had backed up slightly, the way people back up when they realize they're standing too close to something that's going to be discussed for years. He had, I think, spent the morning feeling that the arbitration had gone better than expected. The title boundary ruling had gone against them, yes, but it hadn't been catastrophic. He had been preparing his return to Fenwick, his report to the Pack Council, the polished version of events that left Fenwick's dignity intact. He had not expected the day to end here. In the market square of the settlement his pack had been trying to tax for 12 years, facing the Alpha King of Thornmere and a woman who had once been one of theirs. He began. The record will be corrected, I said. That's not a request. A formal notice will go to Fenwick from Thornmere within the week. I looked at him another moment. He was not going to argue. He was going to go home and argue with himself in private, and arrive at the conclusion that there was nothing to be done, which was the correct conclusion. Thank you for your participation in today's arbitration. He nodded once and looked away, and I turned from him, because he was no longer the interesting part of the afternoon. The settlement steward was there, Merritt, the older woman who had run the market and the hall, and probably settled half the disputes in Ashgate for 30 years, with nothing more than a clear head and a fair hand. She was looking at us with the particular expression of someone who is going to remember this for the rest of her life, and is already deciding how to describe it to someone who wasn't there. Merritt, I said, this woman's lease on the dyeing shed will hold until she chooses otherwise. Her record in the settlement will be amended, not wolfless, not unaffiliated. Mark her as under the protection of Thornmere. I looked at Sella. For now. Until we can arrange something more formal. Sella said, you don't need to do that. I know, I said. I want to. She was quiet for a moment. The silver of her wolf pressed against the bond mark on her wrist, and she looked down at it. Not with shock now, not with grief. With something slower. Something that was taking its time arriving, because it had been away for a long while. Sella, I said, what do you want? She looked up at me. I held her gaze and waited. I had the maps. I had the evening ride. I had a hold to return to and 100 things that would need doing when I got there. I had 8 years of governance that had not left much room for this. I had, right now, one question that mattered. She said, I want to know what she sees, my wolf. A pause. She's been quiet so long. I don't know, I want to know what she was waiting for. Me, I said. I'm fairly certain. She looked at me for a long moment, then, very quietly, not a smile exactly but the place a smile was going. That's a bit presumptuous. The mark on my wrist agrees with me. She was quiet another moment. I need to send for my tools, she said, the dyeing equipment. We'll send for it. And my notebooks. I keep records of the tide line. 7 years of them. I was going to give them to the settlement archive, but I'd like to have them. We'll send for those too. She looked at the square, at Marit, who gave her a small nod, a real one. At the settlement she had lived in for 7 years, the only home she'd made since the one she'd been driven from. I saw her register it, not as a loss exactly, more as a closing, the way you close a door on a room you're grateful for and ready to leave. She looked back at me. All right, she said. I had brought 6 riders with me and a supply horse. We put Sella on the supply horse, which was better mannered than its role suggested. She sat straight. My captain fell in beside me and said nothing for the better part of a mile, which was his best quality. We rode north. After a time, Sella said, she's different from what I imagined. When I was young and I thought about my wolf, I thought she'd be like the other girls' wolves. Loud, fast, eager. A pause. She's not any of those things. What is she? I said. Patient, she said. I think she's been waiting a very long time. I think she knew something I didn't. My wolf stirred, and I understood this completely. I had thought, in quieter years, that perhaps the bond simply didn't come for every king, that it was a thing some men had and others managed without. I had managed well enough. 8 years of managing, which was not the same as enough but was what I had. My wolf has been still for 8 years, I said. Functional, present, but still, the way a held breath is still. Tonight's the first time in 8 years he's moved like that. She said, quietly, what did it feel like? I thought about the step into the dyeing shed, the smell of indigo and river water, the thing my wolf had done, the absolute, uncomplicated turning. Like recognizing something I didn't know I'd lost, I said. She didn't speak for a while. The light was going golden and long across the hillside, the kind of afternoon light that makes northern country look kinder than it usually is. "I thought she hated me," she said. "My wolf. For a long time I thought she'd gone quiet, because something in me was wrong, that I wasn't, that the pack was right, that I wasn't the kind of woman whose wolf stayed." I looked at her. "She stayed," I said. "She was just waiting." "I know that now." She paused. "It's a strange thing to learn at 26. Better at 26 than never," I said. She turned her face toward me, and in the gold of the late afternoon, I saw what her composed face looked like when it was beginning to be certain of something. Not certain of me, it was far too soon for that, and she was not a woman who would be rushed by a bond mark into a feeling she hadn't felt yet. But certain of something. That the wolf had known. That the waiting had been the right kind of patience. That the silence hadn't been abandonment. "I have questions," she said. "Yes," I said. "Many of them." "I'd expect nothing less," I said. "You kept 7 years of tide records in a dyeing shed for the pleasure of knowing exactly where the waterline fell. You are not a woman who proceeds without data." She considered this. "That's accurate," she said. "Good. Then you know what data we have. A bond mark on both wrists, 2 wolves that recognized each other in a dyeing shed on a Tuesday afternoon, and a border settlement that will be talking about this for the next 20 years. She said, "Was Aldris's face actually that color, or was I imagining it?" "It was that color," I said. "He'll have a long ride back to Fenwick." Something moved in her face. The place a laugh was, not quite arriving, but close. 7 years, she said. And this time it was the third meaning, not the exile, not the waiting, but the sheer strangeness of a Tuesday afternoon, in a dyeing shed, overturning 7 years of silence in the space of a single step. 7 years, I agreed. We rode on. Thornmere came into view as the last light was fading. The hold lights up on the ridge, warm and steady, the kind of lights that mean a fire has been kept since morning and someone is expecting a king back by supper. My captain had sent a rider ahead. There would be food and a room, and the ordinary evening business of a working hold. At the gate, my steward Browen was waiting. Browen had been waiting at gates for me since I was 24, and he had the look of a man who had already been told the essentials and was working out how to ask the rest. He looked at Selah on the supply horse. He looked at the mark on my wrist. He looked at me. "My king," he said. "Browen," I said. "This is Selah. She is my fated mate. She'll need a room in the east wing, something with a good window and a work table, if one is available. She'll be sending for her things from Ashgate. And I'll need someone to draft a correction to Fenwick's pack record regarding her status. Go out with tomorrow's post." Browen wrote none of this down, because Browen had never needed to write things down. He would remember every word. "Yes, my king," he said. He turned to Selah with the particular dignity a good steward has. Respectful, not fawning. "Welcome to Thornmere." Selah looked at him, and then at the hold. The stone walls, the firelight in the upper windows, the hold wolves in the yard, who had lifted their heads at our arrival, and were now looking at her with the alert, interested stillness of animals that sensed something new. The wolves began to drift toward her. Not all of them, just the nearest 3, then 2 more, the way it happens when pack animals decide something collectively. They came to her horse and stood near it, not asking for anything, just present. One of the older wolves pressed its flank against her stirrup. She looked down at it. She looked at the hold. She looked at me. "A good window and a work table," she said. "And dinner," I said. "If you haven't eaten." "I haven't." We rode through the gate. The pack settled around us as we went in, not bowing, not making ceremony of it, just the quiet adjustment of a hold that has sensed a change and is receiving it. The wolves in the yard, the stable hands, who looked up and looked again. The cook's assistant who came to the kitchen door and then went quickly back inside, which meant Browen had already sent word and there would be enough food. Selah dismounted without help and gave the supply horse a brief, absent pat on the neck. Not a greeting exactly, more the acknowledgement of an animal that had carried her without complaint for 2 hours. Then she followed Browen toward the east wing. At the door she paused, and I thought she was going to say something practical about the Tide notebooks or the dyeing equipment. Instead, she said, "Did you know, when you came back to the market, did you know what you were doing?" I thought about the boundary markers I had not needed to look for, about Vel pulling right on the ridge, about a wolf that had gone still in a direction it had never turned before. "No," I said, "but I knew it was something." She nodded. She went inside. I stood in the yard for a moment. The hold was settling into its evening. The wolves had gone back to their places, except the old one that had stood at her stirrup, which was now sitting by the east wing door, as though it had always been there. My wolf was still. Not the held-breath stillness of 8 years. A different kind. The stillness of something arrived, of something that has been coming a long way and is finally, quietly, home. In 8 years I had learned that governance was mostly the patient work of small correct decisions, made many times over. You rode to the border settlement, you asked the right question about the title line, you looked at the tide mark, you wrote the honest judgment. Sometimes you stepped off a threshold without entirely knowing why, and the world rearranged itself. I went inside. Over the weeks that followed, the hold arranged itself around her, the way a hold does when it recognizes something true has come into it. Gradually, without theater, the way the wolves had come to her at the gate. Brouwen found her a room with a north window, where the light was good for color work and where she put the Tide notebooks on the shelf the day they arrived from Ashgate and did not open them again for 2 weeks, because she was busy learning which wolves liked to be in the east wing in the afternoon and which didn't, and which of the kitchen staff made tea she liked, and what the hold's layout meant for someone who'd been in a 2-room dyeing shed for 7 years. She asked questions. Not shy ones, real ones, the kind that assume you'll answer honestly and trust you to tell her when you can't. She asked me about the pack structure and the treaty obligations and what the eastern border situation actually was, because the boundary arbitration in Ashgate had made her curious about how many others were ongoing and whether the pattern of encroachment from the eastern holds was a deliberate strategy or ordinary land hunger. She asked about the wolves and which ones were bonded to which packmates and what the protocol was when a new wolf arrived. She asked about the hold's water source and the quality of the winter stores and whether the eastern trade road was maintained year-round or closed above the snowline. Brouwen answered most of these with the tone of a man who has been waiting 20 years for someone to ask useful questions. She was careful with the hold's people, not standoffish, but deliberate. She learned names before she used them. She watched how things worked before she said anything about them. The cook's third assistant taught her where the herb stores were kept. She paid for this with an afternoon spent helping sort the autumn drying, and by the end of it they were talking about the title line records as though herb drying and tide tables had something to do with each other, which apparently they did, if you were Sella and paid attention to the way patterns worked. She asked about my wolf once, early on. She said, "What's his name?" I said I hadn't named him. She said, "Why not?" I said, "I didn't know him well enough. He's been quiet." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You should. He's not quiet anymore." She named her own wolf that same week. I heard her tell Brouwen. The old wolf who'd taken to her at the gate had apparently become a fixture in the east wing, and she was explaining to Brouwen that she'd been calling her Kala, which meant something in the old language that Brouwen confirmed meant the one who waits for the right season. He said it gravely. She accepted it gravely. The old wolf, for his part, had by then taken to sleeping across the threshold of the east wing room, with the north window, which meant anyone coming or going had to step over a large, deeply self-satisfied animal, and no one in the hold seemed to think this required comment. I named my wolf 3 days later, after watching him follow her across the courtyard on a cold morning when she was checking the outer wall for frost damage, which was a thing she had decided needed checking apparently, and he was walking at her left shoulder the way a wolf walks when it is not accompanying someone, but simply going where it intended to go, which happened to be the same direction. Tiern, an old word that meant the one who turns. She laughed when I told her. "That's very specific," she said. "He is very specific," I said. She thought about this. "Kala waited," she said. "Cairn turned. I suppose that's the whole story in 2 words." "More or less," I agreed. The bond mark had settled in, not fading, just becoming part of what was there, the way a well-fitted join in a stone wall stops being a join and starts being part of the wall. She wore it without ceremony. She didn't hide it. She didn't make an occasion of it. She was Sella, And she dyed cloth and kept records and asked questions and knew exactly where the tide line fell, and she was my fated mate, and both things were simply true at the same time, fitting the same space without either one having to give way. The formal ceremony came 2 months later, not a grand public claiming, but Thornmere's traditional hold joining, which was smaller and quieter, witnessed by the pack and the hold's elder wolves, held in the courtyard under the first real snow of the season. Brawin read the old binding words. I said what I meant, which was, in summary, that I had gone to Ashgate to settle a boundary dispute and come back with something I hadn't known I was looking for, and that I intended to spend the considerable remainder of my reign being grateful for the Tuesday afternoon in a dyeing shed that had made it possible. She said what she meant, which was fewer words, that she had believed her wolf was gone, and she had been wrong, and she was glad to have been wrong. Cairn and Calla stood beside us. Cairn put his muzzle briefly against Calla's shoulder, and she pressed back, and the pack registered this with the quiet approval of people watching something that has found its place. Brawin sent the revised Fenwick record to their hold the following morning, with a covering note from me that I will admit was more pointed than strictly necessary. Marit at Ashgate sent a letter of congratulations that included 7 dried indigo flowers and a small jar of dye, which was the most practical and therefore most Sela-appropriate gift I received. The boundary dispute at Ashgate was formally settled. Fenwick paid the tidal line settlement fee without further argument. 7 years is a long time to believe something that isn't true. I thought about that, in the months after, watching Sela in the courtyard with the hold's wolves around her, watching her at the east wing window with her tied notebooks finally open, the years of careful records laid out in a sequence that now told a different story than the one she'd thought she was keeping. 7 years of evidence that the settlement was real, that the work was good, that the life was worth living, all of it true, and underneath it, the whole time, a wolf that was patient in the way her own words said, waiting for the right season. She found me in the hall one evening, reading boundary maps, not Ashgate's, a new set, a different border, the ordinary work of a kingdom that bordered 6 others and was always negotiating one thing or another. She sat across the table from me and pulled a piece of the map toward her and looked at it. There's a crossing here, she said, pointing. That doesn't match the river survey from 3 years ago. See? The survey has the crossing 20 meters further upstream. I looked. She was right. Where did you see the survey? I said. Brawin had it filed in the East Wing archive. I've been reading through it. A pause. I hope that's all right. Sela, I said, you may read anything in this hold that interests you. The boundary records are interesting, she said. I believed her entirely. I was not surprised. I was wrong, you know, she said, still looking at the map. Earlier, when I said I wanted to know what she sees, I thought I was asking what she was waiting for, but I think I was really asking whether she was still there. I looked at her. She is, I said. She is, she agreed. She traced the river line on the map. It's strange. For 7 years I thought the silence meant she'd given up on me, but I think she never stopped. I think she was just keeping still, keeping ready. She looked up. I should have trusted her more. I thought of Cyrn. 8 years of held-breath stillness, and the step into the dyeing shed, and the way he'd turned. We might have found each other sooner, I said. Or we found each other at exactly the right time, she said, in the tone of a woman who has kept 7 years of tide records and knows that timing is not always a failure of planning. She looked back at the map. I looked at her. The fire was low and warm. Cairn was asleep somewhere in the hall, and Calla was in the east wing where Sela's notebooks were, and the hold was quiet, the way a hold is quiet in winter when everyone is inside and the work is good and the cold is kept where it belongs. I said, thank you. She looked up. For what? For not sending me out of the shed, I said. She considered this. You didn't leave, she said. No, I agreed. I noticed, she said, and went back to the map. That was all. The fire settled. The map spread between us, the kind of work that would keep for morning, and we let it keep, and I stayed at the table, and Sela stayed at the table, and the hold breathed around us with the steadiness of a place where something true has finally come to rest. Cairn, who had been still for 8 years, who had turned on a ridge road above a border settlement and never once turned back, slept the sleep of an animal that has found what it was looking for. He did not turn back in the morning either, nor the morning after that.